Okay, so we know that after World War I, there's a rise in um, the ideas of nationalism, particularly in terms of national self-determination. But there's also this rise in control over colonies. And one of the first places really affected by that after World War I is the place of Palestine. Now, Palestine originally was a Muslim country held by, in part by the British, and the British are given a mandate of this starting after World War II. But Britain also, if you remember, issues the Balfour Declaration. And in this declaration, they say that the British will help establish a colony oh, sorry, not a colony, will establish a country, a Jewish country in Palestine, in the Holy Land. So with that promise, you have the ultimate separation of, and what will happen after World War II is the separation of the two countries into a Muslim and a Jewish country, a Muslim Palestine and a Jewish Israel. But that won't happen for many years in the future. But in the early 1920s, Britain commits itself to that through the issuing of the Balfour Declaration. Now, moving forward, we also know that there's a larger issue that develops here, and that is in India. Now, in India, we know that there's a long tradition and a long history of nationalism. And the first real outbreak of it begins in 1857 with the Sepoy Mutiny. So if you remember, Sepoys are British-trained Indian soldiers who begin to rebel against the British because they're both Muslim and they're both Hindu. They're Muslim and Hindu soldiers. Now, there's a rumor that begins that the rifles that the British are giving the Indian soldiers are greased with either pig or cow fat. Now, for those of you who know many things about your religious studies, what that means is the Hindus are unable to touch the ones that might have beef. Hindus cannot touch the beef ones, while the Muslims cannot touch the pork ones. So that creates a problem. There's a rebellion that occurs, and this is ultimately squashed by the British and the British East India Company. But this history of independence continues through the creation of the Indian National Congress in 1885, the separation into the Muslim League and the Hindu League. They both fight for the superiority, let's say, of their group, whether Hindu or Muslim. And then ultimately with the ascension and the rise of Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru and Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Now we know that ultimately India is divided between different countries. So you have the creation of India, the country, Pakistan, and then which would be West Pakistan, and then East Pakistan, and then Burma, which becomes Myanmar, and then obviously Bangladesh turns into, East Pakistan turns into Bangladesh in 1971. But, so India has this long tradition starting with the Sepoy Mutiny of 1857, and then you have the creation of the Indian National Congress 1885, and then the different paths of independence that emerge, particularly with the help of Mahatma Gandhi. In Turkey, you have the rise of Mustafa Kemal. Now, Turkey has a very interesting place, right? This part of Turkey, and Istanbul, consequently, the capital, is Istanbul, which is on the European part of Turkey, while you have this larger part here that is actually not in Europe, right? This is in Asia. So the capital here is Ankara. When Mustafa Kemal takes over, he wants to create an independence or a nationalism that is more Western in culture, more Westernization, right? So what happens here, you have Kemal taking over, and then he changes many things about it. So he changes his name to Kemal Ataturk, father of the Turk. Ataturk means. So he also wants to get rid of the Sultan and make it democracy. And all of these things occur very quickly after World War I. All right, and then finally, before we move to Africa, you have the beginning of the Boxer Rebellion. So in late 1800s, early 1900s, in China, you have the creation, you have the attempt to rid China of foreign, or at least European powers. And you have the beginning of the Boxer Rebellion. So you have the Society of the Harmonious Fists, who were boxers, begin their rebellion against the British, the Americans, the French, the Russians, and the like. What ultimately happens is, because the boxers are trying to get rid of the stronger European and American powers, they are ultimately squashed by the joint military tasks of them. Fast forwarding a little bit, you then have the rise of communism. So you have a nationalist party that forms, the Kuomintang Party, but because of different ideas of politics, that is split. So you have the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, pictured here, and the Nationalist Party, led by Chiang Kai-shek. The two will battle, and ultimately communism will take over in China, but not until after World War II. But this fighting will continue, and rebellions will begin, but it's all over the idea of trying to get rid of international control. And the nationalists will not be able to keep up with Mao and the communists. Finally, turning our attention then to Africa, you have the emergence of Pan-Africanism in the 1940s, 50s. And this is the idea that Africa should be united, and that Africans all around the globe should be connected. And out of that, you have the creation of this nationalist movement that is going to be looking for that. And even the British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, when he makes a speech in South Africa in 1963, he says the winds of change are upon us. And the winds of change mean that we cannot ignore the fact that Africa will want to be independent. He references India in Asia in the 1940s. And he says that we cannot ignore the fact that this is happening. So in the 1940s, 50s, Ghana, under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah, begins a system of boycotts and peaceful resistance towards British control. If you remember, he boycotts many of the British products starting in 1947. And what ultimately happens as a result of that is, even though some riots break out, Britain moves to a system of self-rule, and then ultimately, after self-rule, to full independence for Ghana in 1957. Much different from that is the example of Kenya. So Kenya now on the other side of the country in East Africa. In this situation, Britain is not as successful. So Britain begins with trying to give Kenya its self-rule, but then ultimately can't sustain that. So violence will ultimately erupt between the Kikuyu tribe, or the Mau Maus, and they will begin to fight against the British, the whites living in Kenya, over the good territory called the Central Highlands, where the capital of Kenya is Nairobi. This fighting will continue, the revolutions will continue, but unlike Ghana, Kenya is quite different from the system of violence. So ultimately what happens here is you have the rise of violence and rebellion in Africa. Finally turning to South Africa, and here we know the history of apartheid beginning with the different laws that are passed, such as the 1950 Group Areas Act, and then the 1959 Bantu Self-Government Act. Now we know that Nelson Mandela will begin his political career trying to get rid of the system of apartheid. He will be put in jail for 27 years because of it, and ultimately win a Nobel Peace Prize because of it. We talked briefly about the sort of mixed history that Mandela has, because people see him as a terrorist as well as a liberation leader. But I think the majority of the world can easily say that Mandela is certainly peaceful figure. Now, since the end of decolonization in the 1960s, 1970s, Africa has suffered a great deal, and we know that some of the major things that Africa has faced have been things like ethnic violence, where when borders were originally formed, they took no concern over the different tribal or national groups or ethnic groups that were there, many of which had very long-standing hatreds towards one another. So Europe made these boundaries, and as a result, we have, after Britain, France, and Germany, all those countries leave, you have this huge problem of violence between them because of that. You also have economic problems. Because of the nature of imperialism when it begins in the 1800s, and that extraction-based economy, Africa never had the way to develop, or a system of development, or even the train system that they have there does not encourage trade, but instead encourages extraction of goods. So Africa has suffered a great deal because of that. And as a result, also they have had corruption because of the vacancies that are made when the Europeans leave. The British, the French, and all them never really trained other leaders. So what you have after that is a system where the leadership is very corrupt, money does not go where it's supposed to go, and ultimately the problems that come out of that. And finally, environmental problems. There's been huge problems of deforestation and desertification, all of this creating weakness and causing the susceptibility to diseases. And then the diseases are further exacerbated because of their economic problems, because Africa does not have the ability to afford the medication in many cases that they could easily manage their symptoms. So nationalism here leads to the independence of countries, and it all stems out of World War I, World War II, and the passion for self-government, self-rule, and national self-determination.